Hello, fellow Griever. This is the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. This week, you have found yourself with me for one of my shorter, solo Down the Rabbit Hole episodes. Here, I take you with me on a journey of sorts, through thoughts in my own griefy mind. Some days, I may tackle topics as if I am in Alice's shoes, slaying the Jabberwocky. And on others, I may end up in my own pool of tears. Or I may just go a bit sideways and paint the proverbial roses red. But I always promise an adventure. So let's dive down the rabbit hole and see just what sorts of madness we might discover together. I am glad you have joined me, because while I do know how lonely this grief is, I also believe we needn't be alone. Welcome. Hello, and welcome, fellow grievers. We are down the rabbit hole today, and we are down the rabbit hole for episode 17 in season 5. And today, from the tricky rabbit hole, I'm going to discuss grief hangovers. This is a term that is not new to me. It's not an original term, although I will tell you that when I first started saying it, it was not something I could immediately credit to somebody, meaning I have no idea if I heard it somewhere where I heard it. But I'm going to guess that it just came to me in a natural way, the way it has come to a lot of the other people that I have seen writing about it online now that I started looking, because they had the same feeling. They have experienced a grief hangover like I have, and it is a kind of natural term to put on it because, for lack of a better word, it's a lot of what we feel the day after a big day. We feel tired. We feel emotional. Sometimes we feel sick to our stomach, or we don't have an appetite. A lot of times we have a headache. We might have irritated eyes. We might have all sorts of things that can come after we have had a night out of pushing it too far, of a night out of excess, because that's what happens. We go into this fight or flight mode on the day of. And a lot of times we've built up to it. We build up to that day of. And then for the day of, many people will say that the day after often feels worse to them. And sometimes even several days after often feel worse. And the reason for that is it's a physiological and emotional response in both. Is our bodies and our brain put us into a state to be in a hyper-functioning mode on those days a lot of times, whether we're having an event to memorialize or whether we're doing things with our family because it's the birthday or the date of our loved one's passing. We put ourselves into a more hyper-aroused state of functioning. So think of that in the terms of a hangover. When we are out partying to excess, then we have to recover the next day. So that's why the same thing happens to us after a major event, is we often find ourselves feeling in that just hangover mode of being overly tired, overly emotional, just completely wiped out and depleted. And that comes from the crash that happens afterwards. So now, what I'm doing this episode for is I want to talk about, is there a cure for this? If you find yourself waking up and you're like, this is it. This is a grief hangover the day after a birthday or a holiday or the date of their passing. Is there things that can make it better if you're in the throes of one? And then the other side of that, is there a prevention? And I'll even call it an intervention. Is there a way that we can intervene as we build up to this day that could prevent, for the most part, the grief hangover? And I'm going to say yes to both. But I'm also going to put in ellipses there and say kind of. There's kind of a cure and there's kind of a prevention. Because nothing in this world is linear or absolute, unfortunately. So some of the feelings I've already been over, which can be all of those things that can happen in a regular hangover, with the exception of some of the physical stuff isn't quite as bad, depending on how bad we ate. But a lot of it is the same. The headaches, the tiredness, the feeling overly emotional and upset. Those things all occur. So let's talk about the things we can do if we find ourselves in the midst of a grief hangover. In other words, the curative steps that we could do to get ourselves back on track. And I want you to think about this in a couple of ways. Think about a cell phone battery or iDevice that's been completely depleted, maybe sitting right down there, 1%. Or maybe worse yet, we actually let it completely drain its battery down before we even noticed, and now it has to be completely recharged. Think of us as that battery the day after a big event. And when you charge a device, you have to give some form of time to it. So there is a time frame, several hours, obviously, but we could, in the human body, it may take us a day or two. So think of that recharging situation as something that's necessary, or that device won't be recharged. The recharging process has to take place, and part of what we can do are things like, obviously, lots of sleep, eat right, take our supplements and vitamins if we're not, take extra ones that maybe help rebuild your depleted vitamins, slow down, simplify and clear our calendars for at least a few days, right? It's kind of an intentionality thing, right? We have to be really intentional if we find ourselves in the middle of that. And yes, I would say that if you find yourself in the middle of a severe grief hangover, it can be as good of a cause for a PTO day or a self-care day as any I've seen. But that's where now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what's really that prevention side of things. And if we focus on that, then hopefully we have less days that we actually have to deal with the grief hangover. And I'll give an analogy for that too. The older I get, the less hangovers in life that I have, meaning we'll just talk about traditional hangovers. I do not overindulge on alcohol hardly ever at this point in my life. I'm old enough to know that I don't like how that feels, that's not something I care to do. I'm not young like I used to be. I don't rebound the way I used to be. I don't know if you guys have found that to be true, but 20-year-olds or 25-year-olds can go out and tie one on and function the next day at work. They may be a little hungover. They throw a few remedies at it, and then they function, and by later in the day, they're pretty good. It takes me longer than that to recover from an actual hangover. And so consequently, I hardly ever do it. I have put in lots of steps in place in my life that remind me of what the hangover feels like. So I know my drink limits. I know when to start drinking water. I know, what types of alcohol don't work well with me or make me feel worse. So those are all things I've learned over time. You can do the same thing with grief. And so unfortunately, again, going back to time is one of those things. And I always say time doesn't heal, but time is an element in our life, and it does factor into our grief journey as far as what we do with that time. And some of these things that happen with our grief journey can only become clearer after enough time has passed. And that means trial and error time that we have maybe done things correctly, times that we haven't done them correctly, so we see why it's important to do them correctly. And sometimes we listen to things like this and realize that if we set ourselves up for a better scenario to start with, we can learn from the dumb mistakes of people like me who did it wrong for a couple of years until they figured out there was a better way to do this. So to avoid a really bad grief hangover, I find that there are kind of a few things that are really important to talk about with these takeaways that I want for you to take with you today. And the first thing is me just drilling in another point that I make all the time, which is plan to give yourself a lot of space and grace around these dates. I always talk about flexibility for a reason, and the flexibility follows under space and grace, because what you're doing in this space and grace piece is setting a foundation or a bedrock for the other things that I'm going to talk about. So if we give ourselves space and grace, we're flexible with our schedule leading up to the event and coming off of the event. And I'll give you a concrete example. You might think like, for example, Melissa, what are you talking about? I'm talking about if your schedule will allow, take the day off before the day, if you can, the day of and the day after. And some of us are self-employed or have a lot of PTO or fill in the blank. We have jobs that accommodate this better than others. So I understand what I'm saying doesn't apply to everybody, but I'm going to say at the bare minimum, I would take the day off, but the day after, before I would take the day before, because it's almost always worse the day after than it is the day before. And sometimes staying busy the days before is the best thing we can do. And then to give ourselves that space the day of and the day after is really important for the recovery process. So that flexibility and building in time for you or time for self-care are really what allows for that space and grace and for you to give yourself the time to recharge that you're going to need. So the other things that I want you to think about are, like I've said, this isn't linear. And we're going to make some mistakes. We're going to take a few steps back once in a while. So take the time to create a plan for if the hangover happens. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes there's so many moving parts with other family members and things that are not all in our control that sometimes even the best laid plan can go awry. Because after all, this is loss, traumatic loss by suicide. So things don't always go to plan. So to have a backup plan for if that hangover occurs is also a very powerful tool, because going into it, we know if we just put ourselves at ease by knowing we've made a plan. And so I want to suggest something that I'm just going to call a kit. I don't know what else to call it. So I'm just going to call it a kit. And you can put it together however you want, but I, honest to goodness, would love you to consider putting it together. And by doing that, I would love to see you get a box or a tote or a basket, something that you like, that makes you feel, that you enjoy looking at. You can put it someplace, set it there, and almost see it as a reassurance, a safety net, if you will. That's why I say a pretty basket or box or something that you could tuck away in a spot, but it's there. It's kind of like knowing that we have ibuprofen if we need it, or knowing that if you have an allergy, there's an EpiPen in your pocket. It's that kind of safety net, you guys. That's why this is an important step. So I want you to put in that kit, that grief hangover kit, stuff that makes you feel good and cared for and relaxed, something that will help you recharge those batteries the next day. And some of it might be physical medications, like if you do well with headache medicine, whatever that happens to be. I don't want to recommend certain ones because some people do better with acetaminophen and some people with ibuprofen. I've talked before on the podcast about how I take supplements, natural supplements like ashwagandha and L-theanine and things like that help with anxiety and overwhelm. They help differently. Ashwagandha is more of a buildup and L-theanine is more of a instant type thing. But I, for example, would have probably a couple extra doses of L-theanine tucked away in that kit so that I could start my day off with something that helped calm me down. I would probably put in I shouldn't say probably. I have in the past. I do not in my new house here in the Caribbean have that, but in the past I actually had a kit, and it was a basket that used to be my grandma's, and it was a basket that actually brought me a lot of comfort because it was my grandma's that I love so much. And I did have lots of little things in there. I had a couple of my favorite books, usually magazines that I wouldn't otherwise get to because I was too busy. I had a candle. I had a few personal care items, like I really enjoy those face masks. I only enjoy two kinds of face masks. Some of them I don't like at all, but I enjoy the ones that are clay that get really firm on your face, and I enjoy the peel off kind. At the time, I had a tube of clay mask in there. If you do heating pads, it's a good place for a heating pad or hot water bottle, which can just be comforting. I always have my, a weighted blanket close by anyway. I usually sleep with it most nights, even now, to help calm my nervous system. And so that doesn't have to go in the basket, but I would recommend considering getting one. A lot of these kind of comfort items can be found on my website also if you're wanting to know where to start with these kind of comfort items. I have a spot on my website called Things I Love, and it's mostly Amazon links. A couple of them are something else. But even if you didn't purchase those exact products, it gives you an idea of what some of these products are that can really help us during grief. If you diffuse oils regularly, you could have just a little bottle of Serenity in there to remind yourself during the day of the grief hangover to use Serenity either in a roller ball or in your diffuser. The candle can serve the same purpose if it's an aromatherapy candle, but I also suggest having a little, like some physical pictures or something of your loved one in there, because you can light that candle. You can set a few of those pictures out. Definitely give yourself a pad of paper or a journal. And I always recommend multiple journals in our life anyway, because to have one journal for all the things is really hard. So maybe a grief hangover journal. Just get yourself a small notebook, or if you're like me, I have a journal problem. So I have a box full of empty journals. So anytime I need a booklet for a project, or I need an actual journal to write in for a new journal project, I pull something out of that box. And so you could find a pretty one that was appropriate to put in the grief hangover box. And along with that would be my recommendation to use that to journal during that day of how you're feeling, how the event went, how the buildup was, how the day was, and how you're feeling the day after. Because even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you, journaling is a proven therapy. And some of us really go into it kicking and screaming. We say we're not journalers, or we're not good at this, or we're not writers. I promise, if you try it and you stick to it for a while, you will find the therapy in it. Now, that doesn't mean that you will always be a journaler. Sometimes people are only journalers for therapeutic reasons during hard times. And I'm okay with that. I do know there's people that journal every day of their life, and most of those people, for lots of reasons, swear by it. And I would love to say I'm one of those people. I'm not. I tend to be more of a crisis journaler, which is what I'm talking about. Somebody who, when life is a little rougher, takes to a journal as a way to work out my thoughts. So that's why I'm recommending you consider putting that journal in the basket, grief hangover. Heck, you could even buy my journal that's on Amazon. That's a prompted journal. It's only 30 prompts. So it would be a good day to have a prompted journal as a grief hangover day, because that journal reflects on your first year. And so it would be a good time to go back and fill some of those things in to help you work through some of that stuff. So obviously the biggest thing is to have a plan, but that's why I like the idea of a kit, because if we've taken the time to think about how we're going to care for ourselves when this happens, there's power in that as well, right? Because we know we have something to fall back on. The only last thing that I haven't really brought up that I would consider putting in that basket, well, maybe two more things that I haven't brought up. One of them is, I know I talked about books and magazines. Movies would go in that category if you are a DVD watcher. A lot of us just stream nowadays, which will be where the second tip comes in. But if you don't stream, or even if you do, sometimes it's comforting to have a couple of your favorite, feel-good movies tucked into that box. If you don't have them in the cases anymore, like some of us have gotten those folios that we have our movies in. And if you're younger listening to this, you're thinking, who owns movies? But I know we still do. And a lot of people, it would be a good time to kind of talk about simplifying. Don't think about going through a streaming service and search, because we get lost in those searches so easily. Just know you have those couple of feel-good movies in there that you can just pop one into your DVD player and you can stay completely unplugged from the world. You don't accidentally get into a scroll that has you down another rabbit hole, and then you're counterproductive. I don't know if any of y'all have ever done that, but I for sure have, where I've thought about, I've got to find a movie to just unwind. And before I know it, I have found some documentary about something that really gets me fired up. And then I've gone the opposite direction and I'm more anxious than when I started. So that's part of, again, while I'm talking about going back to basics and making this super simple so that we don't have to put our effort towards the process. We just implement it. That thing I told you a minute ago that I thought, besides the movies, was any other tools that you have in your toolbox that works for you. I always had a handful of crystals in that box because there's certain crystals. I had a big chunk of rose quartz that was in there. I had some lepidolite in there. I have amethyst everywhere, so I'm sure there was amethyst in it, but I remember the big chunk of rose quartz and the lepidolite palm stone. And I also had it was a little thing that I made. I made them for a bunch of people at one point. It's something I sewed. I have very basic sewing skills. Like I can sew a curtain and a pillowcase and things like that, but that's about where it ends. This, for better lack of words, is like a headache pad. I don't know what it's, I sewed a rectangle and I stuffed it with flaxseed and lavender, fresh lavender, and then sewed the end shut. So it's like a beanbag kind of, but it's oblong, not square, or rectangle. And it's big enough that it can lay right on my forehead or over my eyes. But because of the flaxseed, you can heat them up in the microwave. And so then the flax gives off the oil and it heats up the lavender and you have a soothing eye mask. And it lasts for quite a while. And the scent does double duty. So the heat helps. That was in there along with this rose quartz and the lepidolite. So tools, right? If you're a meditator, have, this may be something that goes on the last item, which I was going to tell you to get out a pretty piece of stationery or something that you could slip into, some sort of clear cover, or maybe, put it in an envelope inside that. And have it be a secret list to yourself. Like maybe even write yourself a note. Remind yourself why you've put this kit together. Remind yourself of how much you love your loved one and how valued you are and things like that. But on that list, write things that also help calm you down. Put names of podcasts in case you've forgotten. List some TV shows that you've been wanting to watch. Again, make it simple so you don't have to go to all the places and start to search. Just take the time. Take a couple hours one day, sometime in the near future, especially if you know you're in a season or about to go into one, and put this kit together. I know you may think, Melissa, I promise, if you think this is a bad idea the very first time you have a grief hangover and it doesn't serve you, I'd love to hear from you and I'd love to hear what would help more. But I can promise you as much as I'm able to promise that it will help, that you will be glad you've put this together. Throw a few bags of your favorite tea in there. If you're a coffee drinker, go get some of those little instant, that almost feel like guilty pleasure coffee sticks that are the lattes and the chai teas and the different things. And just, put your favorite, tuck those inside of a beautiful coffee mug that you might not normally use that feels like a special occasion. Do things to put things in there to recharge your battery. Now, I've called that your hangover kit, right? So what about then the intervention or the prevention piece? I don't know that I would suggest a kit for that, although as I'm talking through this today, because y'all, I haven't done a prevention kit, but now I think it would almost be like a good thing. But really, just making a plan for prevention, a plan that will help sustain you. Having intentionality towards that day, the day of, but also the day and days after, will go a long way at preventing or greatly reducing the grief hangover. So think about a lot of the things that I just said should go into that backup plan. That backup plan is a safety net. The safety net in itself that was followed by the space and grace that we're giving ourselves by being flexible, giving ourselves extra time. Now, if we stop and make a plan of intentionality of going into that time. So if you can, give yourself that time off. Give yourself windows of time that you know what you're doing. Remember the flexibility piece, though. Plan for flexibility in that plan. I want you to consider listing out the things that you're going to do over those days as you build up for that. Like if you're a journaler or calendar person, write these things in the calendar, write these things out in your journal. But one of the things you have to do in leading up to these days is carve out more self-care time. That goes back to that. These things are all intertwined. These are all interconnected. If you're not seeing it, envision a circle, right? The space and grace, the backup plan, the prevention plan, or the plan to sustain us through the event. These things are all interconnected and woven together. And it creates a bigger picture of just being mindful. Being more mindful creates better balance for us in our life. So if we're more mindful going into the day and weeks in advance, we even have to think about, and I do this wholeheartedly now, I didn't used to, in the week ahead of my son's passing, I lighten my workload. I don't say yes to any extra commitments. The days after, I'm very protective as well. If I plan things, I make sure they're things that I can absolutely handle or have the ability to change if I need to, so that they're not something that's so set in stone that the world would end if they didn't happen. I journal more going into those days. I told you I'm a crisis journaler, but in this life after, because I have done it wrong many times, I have learned that that is actually a good prevention method, because I start journaling in the weeks before. And actually, truth be told, I'm getting ready to start journaling now. July has kind of become July is for journaling for Melissa, because it really does help me get a lot of the things out as I lead up to the date of his death. And July is filled with every single last memory I have of my son. I was lucky enough to have him with us full time for the entire month of July. The last day I saw him in 2016 was July 29th. So, and he came home the last week of June. So I had him all but one day, or maybe all but 2 days of July of that year. So it's filled with every single last memory I physically have of him. Journaling about some of those memories, journaling about how I'm feeling, journaling about the great things that are going on in the world of the leftover piece, all the different things helps my mind and heart and soul prepare for the build up to August 7th. So just knowing that on one hand, it sounds like I've said your hangover kit and your intervention or intentionality plan for avoiding a hangover are similar. Well, you're right. They are similar. If you employ all of those things into the buildup, then you may not have to lean on them as much the day after, if at all. It, all depends, right? So what I think I've done here, you guys, is talk myself into putting my kit together anew, finding a new vessel that makes me feel good. I will put all of the things in there as I directed you to that apply to me and my situation. And I'm going to, for lack of a better term, just call it my grief basket. And it will be there for whether I need it for a buildup or whether I need it to catch me when I have mismanaged and not done so good at the buildup. But it's something that we can customize as we go along, and we find that we're never touching certain parts of it. It can be, we can tuck things in there as we come across them at other times when we're feeling stronger and think, hey, I could really use this the next time I'm having a day where I'm in bed and just can't, deal with the feelings of this all today. And so sometimes if we have that physical place, it'll give us a place to tuck those little surprises that on the days that we really need them, they are kept in a safe space and they are there. And just getting that peace of mind from that safety net and being prepared and knowing that we've put forethought into this, that's going to give us a lot of power in itself. So I'm going to wrap this up for today. I've really kind of talked this every way that I know how for right now, but it just felt really important to talk about because so many people find themselves blindsided and just don't feel like there's anything they can do. And I'm all about empowering you on your grief journey, empowering you to participate. Don't just let time pass because it'll just swallow us up, right? It's what we do with the time that matters. And as I'm closing today, if you are a mother and feel like you could use more connection and support please look into my grief support community on my website. Everything that I do can be found at theleftoverpieces.com. And the podcast always has really inclusive show notes in it. If you're already a podcast listener, you always will find all the links, including to my website, in the show notes. We are currently well into season 5. Remember, I always take guest suggestions. I would be happy to discuss anything that anybody has come to mind. You can set an appointment time to talk to me. And I have some really exciting news coming about a new, really, really good super value membership possibility that I think is going to benefit so many people. And again, I said super value, like most of you won't even believe how great of a value it is. I will be talking about that next week. And it may be 2 weeks before it's out on a podcast, but I will be talking about it in my community next week. I'm finishing putting everything together for that now. I am currently taking people that want to sign up for the Fall Legacy Group to write a chapter about their child if you're a mother, again, and would like to consider having a legacy so that your child can be remembered. Please remember there's only one more time this year that I'm doing that. We are full for this current retreat that is, in July. In a couple of weeks from the time of this release. But within a week, I'm going to have the announcement out for the next retreat, which is going to be as fabulous and yet somewhat different than this one for mothers who have lost a child to suicide in January, probably, of 2025. So that opportunity will be out soon. So lots of things coming. And if you haven't already, please make sure you're signed up for my weekly email. It comes almost every week. Once in a while, I skip a week, but for the most part, or a couple weeks if it would be a hard time of year or something like that. But for the most part, you're going to get it every week on a Wednesday. And it really is just a touch base email. There's always links in there if you want to find things or get updates. I try not to ever hit somebody's email very often. I'm not that person. If you don't already know that, you'll find that out. But so this weekly touch base email really just has some thoughts, and it will direct you to any of the things you need to know that are going on in the community that are built strictly for you. So please reach out if you need anything. Please take care of yourself. Be extra in taking care of yourself. And I hope until we speak next that you give yourself a lot of space and grace. Talk soon. So we'll conclude here for today, but I just wanted to say a few things before you go. If you're new to the podcast and have not listened to the very first episode called Intro Episodes Start Here, all the way back at the beginning of season 1, I would encourage you to do so that you know what to expect from the leftover pieces, because I do have several different styles of episodes that I record, and we do release weekly, almost all of the time. So I hope that you will come back often to join us in this community of suicide loss survivors. If you have not already, also, I would encourage you to check out theleftoverpieces.com, where you can find and have access to all of the things that I currently offer. Some of those things are online Zoom support groups, links to my books, educational opportunities that I'm adding all the time, as well as different downloadables and resources for all suicide loss survivors. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you'd just like to connect with me for any other reason, you can do it through the website as well. So until next time, I just want to remind you that I know how lonely this grief is, but you don't have to be alone. Talk soon.